So welcome everyone and thanks for joining. My name is Magda Gomans and I'll be your moderator today. So welcome to CFICE's first webinar, Building a Better Webinar, a view through experience and research into best practices. And we have two presenters joining us today. And so I'd like to introduce you to Jeannie Ann and Jill Bedford. Jeannie Ann is the Research Services Librarian, Ron Joyce Center, DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. She was also the chair of the Staff Learning and Development Committee for the library, where she gained her knowledge of webinars by watching hundreds of webinars and also investigating what makes a great webinar through current research on webinar best practices. Jill Bedford is a library assistant at the H.G. Thode Library of Science and Engineering at McMaster University. Jill also served on the Staff Learning and Development Committee for the library for 5 years and has been involved with the making of and presenting about webinars since 2014.
Okay, here's the agenda for today's session. So we will briefly cover the benefits of webinars, best practices, challenges, tools we used, and we will have time for a question and answers period afterwards. So, Jeannie and I originally got involved with webinars through the McMaster University Library Staff Training Committee, primarily as purchasers, especially Jeannie, but also as audience. Our experience with creating webinars began when we were invited to provide a training session for the Education Institute on partnership with the Ontario Library Association. Following that, we were invited to present at the Special Library Association West meeting in 2015. And this January, we again presented on the topic of webinars at the 2017 Ontario Library Association Conference. We were hoping to gather audience preferences for what information would best assist them in choosing a webinar to participate in. It's become kind of a thing for us, and we just kind of fell into it because we feel that webinars can be an amazing way to teach, learn, and reach out to people. We're happy to be with you today and share with you what we've learned about webinars over this time as creators, purchasers, and participants. Okay, so what is a webinar? The word webinar is short for web-based seminar. A webinar can be a lot of things: a presentation, a lecture, a workshop delivered over the internet. It can incorporate audio and visual elements as well as audience interaction. Webinars allow organizations to deliver their messages to a number of people at the same time and across geographic boundaries. This delivery model has made webinars an increasingly popular way to connect presentations and training events to everyone. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to what is generally used as the first method of interacting with your audience. Very simply, it's called a poll. We're going to ask you to fill out where you fit into these categories, whether you're an academic member, a community group member, or a volunteer. So please answer using the polling function that will show up at the left of your screen. I'm just going to pull out the interaction now.
And I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to join you. I was all set and ready to go, and what happened, but we already had our first technical glitch. But I am glad that I'm able to join you all, and I am sorry for the delay. But right now we're looking at our audience poll today. So if you could let us know from which group you are from, whether you are an academic, a community staff member, or a volunteer, that will help us to tell us who is our audience today. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is we will end the poll. And so it looks like it's very close. It is between the academic and group staff. We have almost the same amount. Okay. Oh, and there is a question from Julie, who's not sure if she's an academic, but she was a student when I did the evaluation. Okay, so Julie, you can choose either one. You can consider yourself an academic or a community group staff member. That's fine. So I'm going to end the poll, and it's very tight. As I mentioned earlier, we have about 60% representing the community group staff members, and we have about 42% representing academic. Okay. So we're going to go back to the presentation. And just to let you know that we published the results of the poll for you today, but you may choose not to. If there is a time at the end, we will show you further views from Adobe Connect. But these are also tools we will introduce to you later that we walk you through all the stages of creating a webinar using Adobe Connect. The interaction through the poll has been for the benefit as presenters, as we now have a better understanding of our audience and may choose to direct the presentation in a slightly different way. Jill is now going to talk about the benefits of webinars.
So, webinars can be a great tool for an organization or an individual. You can deliver training to many people at the same time who are in different locations. As you've noticed here, we have people from all over the country. They can be very cost effective and reduce the cost of training and meeting. And additionally, recordings can be made available after sessions in order to share the event for those who missed it. So you can present a new program that you've run to others doing similar work. You can create webinars for training for your own organization. You might also want to consider sharing those training sessionars with others in CFICE. Others might be interested. You never know. And for those of you in academia, Kimberly Silk of the Canadian Research Knowledge Network recently spoke at the Ontario Library Association conference on the use of webinars as a form of scholarly communication. And the National Information Standards Organization recently created a draft standard for approval to officially recognize alternative forms of scholarly publication, and those included webinars. So webinars have a number of uses beyond what we're doing now, which I put under teaching and learning. They can be also used for conferencing. Webcams and microphones can be enabled so that everyone can use them as well. We certainly used it while we were making this webinar because Jeannie and I are actually from different campuses located in different cities. Watching and participating in webinars are helpful to you as well. You get access to experts in the field, people you would not normally bring into your organization to do staff training. You get exposed to new ideas you might only hear of at conferences or through publications. So there's a number of benefits to webinars, definitely to consider. Jeannie will now speak to the current state of knowledge of the best practices in webinars.
Thank you, Jill. This section on best practices is based on the review of the literature, as well as our personal experience with webinars. As mentioned earlier, both Jill and I were on the Staff Learning and Development Committee at McMaster, and during the past several years, we used webinars extensively to reach out to many colleagues as possible. We watched quite a number of webinars, varying from basic to introductory to in-depth, from webinars that were freely available to those that had a license or a fee. Webinars included library-specific topics such as copyright or embedded librarianship, and they also included training and development workshops such as facilitating effective meetings and motivation and teamwork. Some webinars were excellent and bang on in terms of content delivery and expectations. Unfortunately, quite a number of webinars didn't match our expectations. This led us to our discussion on how we can determine whether a webinar is right for us and what makes a great webinar. When we moved from viewing to creating our first webinar, we really had no previous experience with webinars and had to rely on a number of resources to create our first webinar. Jill will talk into more detail about the tools that we used later in our presentation. Now I'd like to share with you some of what we learned through the process of creating our first webinar. A lot of this is something you may already know, but our experience highlights the importance of how to develop a strategy for the webinar and keeping the audience engaged at all times. Before you begin even thinking of creating a webinar, you need to consider, what is the purpose? Is it to gather a group of coworkers for a meeting, or is it to teach to a small or large audience? Is it to possibly to promote or host an event? Besides purpose, you need to think about the scope. Who is the attended audience? Is it a department or is it organization-wide? How many people do you expect to attend? Make sure you put everything down in writing, especially if you require a budget. Even if you don't require money, you will need people's time and they may not all come from your department. You will probably also need the approval of a manager, and this requires you to present a case. So doing your homework and including all the details will definitely help. When you actually do the webinar, it is important to keep the audience engaged and to interact with them. On this screen, you will see some of the activities we use to keep the audience engaged. It is important to keep people involved in the webinar. One best practice is to interact every 2 to 3 minutes. Think of staring at a text message for 3 minutes. I'd be bored and distracted too. It can be as simple as to refer participants to a handout page for more information, or get them to do a poll, or to participate in an online brainstorming session. Audience engagement is key to a successful webinar. Keep in mind that people have many learning different styles, and that's critical as well. Other important factors to consider are the background knowledge of participants, as well as their level of interest. Is this something that they are forced to attend, or something they are truly interested in learning? One way of gathering this information is through creating an audience persona.
An audience persona is a variation on a marketing persona. So a fictional profile created by you as a result of user research that represents your ideal audience. Today we're actually going to do an exercise where we'll collect information from you that will be anonymized to create audience personas based on this audience, along with research demographic information that will be sent to you as a follow-up along with the results of the polls taken today. They can be used by reference for you when you're creating your own webinars to allow you to target the message you want to get across. So let's get started. Okay, in this you see we've broken things down and you have a column. So depending on where you are most fall into, we'd like you to scroll down. These are also examples of some of the polls you can use for interaction. The first two that we're offering you allow you to give multiple answers. So you can put in as many answers as are applicable to you. The third line is actually a little different, the third poll at the bottom of the screen. This one allows you to enter an answer. However, you only get one. So what do you like to do for fun? Put as many things as you like in there, from bungee jumping to binge watching TV. It doesn't really matter. What this does is it will eventually give a sense of the audience that you're talking to when you're doing a presentation or a webinar in the future. These results we won't be broadcasting because, as I said, we do want to keep it private information, and it will go into making up the audience persona.
So while Jill is taking us back to the presentation slide, I'm going to go back to webinar best practices. As I'm waiting, I'm going to tell you that the first one is to have an attention-grabbing title. So create an attention-grabbing title so that participants will want to attend. This is the title that we used for our presentation at the Ontario Library Association Super Conference, Zombie Apocalypse: What Happens When the Webinar and the Audience Don't Match. Stay focused. You may need to cover less material, but stay focused so that you are not all over the map trying to cover everything. Staying focused also helps participants stay on track and lessens the opportunity for them to wander during the webinar. The ideal length of a webinar is no more than 60 minutes. I've also seen shorter ones, 15 minutes, that focuses on one topic or provides a quick overview. Any longer than 60 minutes and people will tune out. Within the 60 minutes, plan the actual presentation to be about 30 to 45 minutes with a 15 to 20 minute window for a question and answer period. It is always a good practice to include agenda in your presentation. Having agenda appear every time, changing the sections, keeps people on track. We brought up the agenda as we moved through a presentation, and every section was highlighted. Having the agenda highlighted was actually a suggestion from a webinar participant. Selecting speakers is also very important, and in this case, It's very good because you can have people speaking who have different styles. You don't necessarily need an expert, but sometimes who's knowledgeable on the subject. The speaker should have good presentation skills and be able to multitask during the presentation. In terms of the number of speakers, having more than one speaker is also a great way to engage the audience, as each speaker has a different style, pace, and perspective. One good rule of thumb is to have between 2 to 3 people. Any more, and then it can actually get confusing, unless it is for a panel discussion. Another good thing is to include any handouts as part of the webinar. It can be a takeaway for participants so they don't need to take notes, and they have all the information for future reference when needed. The last point of practice, practice, practice may be obvious, but I can't emphasize this enough. Also, you need to plan for unexpected technical glitches. One of the hugest ones was just today, and I think it was because the internet outage here that I got disconnected just as I was supposed to start. So, and I can tell you also, we almost had a technical glitch every single time that we practiced. We tried using different locations, different computers, headsets, etc., until we found a setting that worked for all of us. Through this practice, we learned that beyond practicing, we needed to have the right environment, including technology support, and an ideal location for the webinar. I'm going to end this section on best practices with a couple of interactive activities we use with our webinars. Just keep in mind, these activities must be perceived as useful and not just filling in time or doing it for the sake of adding an interactive component. Try to think of the learning objective for each activity and connect it to the overall webinar objective. So in this case, this is a poll that we used to find out where our participants were coming from and to what types of training sessions they were used to. Another exercise that we did was we had a stakeholders exercise where participants were asked to share their thoughts on who their stakeholders were, their roles, and benefits to the organization. This exercise linked communication strategies participants would use for each stakeholder. Participants used the chat window to share their information. As an additional benefit, we let everyone know that we would send the results of all the completed polls and brainstorming sessions to the participants after the webinar was completed. Are you still awake? Use humor if you're comfortable with it. As a final note on best practices, I'm going to just briefly touch on formal standards and guidelines. You don't have to read these now. You may not realize, but standards and guidelines already exist for almost all functions that webinars fill, from creating an abstract to teaching and learning to scholarly communication. It's up to us as creators to know and how to use the best practice we can when giving a webinar, and use plain language when doing it. And yes, there is a guideline for plain language. I'm going to now hand it over to Jill, who's going to talk about the challenges we faced.
Okay, we will be the first to admit that creating a webinar has its challenges. I love the whole idea of gadgets and technology. However, in practice, I'm the person whose children laugh at her. Well, nicely trying to hide it, but I can tell when I get frustrated with a piece of technology or software. But I figure if I can make a webinar, anyone can. However, there were several times where we ran into challenges when making our webinar, and I'm going to go over them with you now and what we were able to do about it. The first big challenge is for most people seems to be learning the webinar software. But there are a lot of tools that can actually help you with that, as can your hosting institution. We ran actually a 3-month trial and error process in creating our first webinar to find a situation that worked. And what we came up with was the above requirements. We work in a library, and libraries are not exactly set up for doing webinars. We have a lot of public computers, and those don't work. Wi-Fi can cause issues. Anyway, these were our requirements that we came up with for doing a webinar in our situation. We did have issues with Wi-Fi. Sometimes Wi-Fi dropped out or caused delays, and as a matter of fact, we ran focus groups when we were creating our first webinar so that we could get feedback from our peers. And the first day of our very first focus group, we lost wireless campus-wide. Technology can also be an issue. Yeah, the whole PC versus Macs thing. PCs just in general seem to work better. The interface with Macs seem to have a few more technology issues that you'll need to solve. However, we did find that the Mac operated better when accessing Adobe Connect with Firefox. And Adobe Connect is actually what we've used to create our webinar, to do our webinars. That's what the hosting institutions have used. Also, you need to remember that Adobe requires add-ons offered through pop-ups when you are creating a webinar. So make sure whatever browser you're using allows for them. It's automatic to block pop-ups on browsers. We also had a number of challenges in terms of audio. However, if you're using Adobe Connect, a lot of these can be taken care of by running the sound check through Adobe. A couple of other tips. When not speaking, turn off your mic. Then what you're doing won't spill into somebody else's talk. And here's the other one. Don't forget to turn it on after when it's your turn to talk. And finally, remember that most headsets also have an on-off button as well. Yeah, I've knocked that one off by mistake as well, speaking from experience. Another challenge was juggling a shared document. That was with multiple people. So what we used to solve it was we used Dropbox, and we worked with one document only. And when we put it up in there, we titled it with the date, the time, and the last person to edit it, so we can keep track of the various versions. Another was finding the time to work together. Jeannie and I are on different schedules. She works days, I work evenings. We're on different campuses in different cities. So you can see that is a challenge, and you might run into it too. Another challenge is working without an audience. Since you can't see them, it becomes difficult to gauge their reactions, where you should explain further, or because they're looking a little confused, or backing away from something as people are kind of going, oh yeah, I know that. This is where practice sessions with a focus audience, so a small sampling of people who will give you feedback is very essential. It's also why we worked on that audience profile, so you can have a focus on who you are creating a presentation for. We've included information on this in the handouts that we've given you. You can look, if you want to create your own audience profile, there's a checklist in there that you can run through for who your audience is going to be. And the final challenge, how do you know that people have actually learned anything? During our time on the training committee, we found that if we offered a print survey before an in-person training session, most people filled them out. And if we offered it to them online after the training session, we actually had a 0% response rate. So how do you deal with this in a webinar? Another best practice is to make time for it during the session. And though it's still a little early, we're actually going to provide time for you now to fill out a survey about the webinar as another layout. 1 second, it's coming up. We're going to ask you to fill this out, please.
Okay, so this poll is actually a self-assessment survey, and we would like you to complete all 6 polls. So please note that your answers will be anonymous, and should you have any questions, please use the chat box. Once you finish your poll, maybe if you could raise your hand, that would be great, then we will know. Okay, so I think everybody is done, so I'm going to pass it now back to Jill, who's going to talk about the tools that we used. Okay, thank you, everyone.
So sorry for the quiet as we're changing layouts. Another note, we did find that often audio cuts out when you change layouts within Adobe Connect, so that is something to be aware of. So next we're going to talk about the tools that we used to help us both create the webinars and solve issues. In terms of physical tools, it's actually really easy. All you need is a computer and a headphone. and access to the software. Good quality headphones actually do make a difference, so use the best pair you can. Primary software tools that we used. Well, we use PowerPoint. It's familiar to those of us that were making the webinar, and it's very flexible. Adobe Connect, of course. That's how you guys are accessing this, and this is where it's being hosted. When we started, we knew very little about Adobe Connect, and this is where the last one comes in. Lynda.com we used for training on Adobe Connect. It was a really handy reference tool for learning Adobe Connect, and also in terms of how to run a webinar. Again, best practices and other tips and hints that you can use. These are the resources that we use through lynda.com. I'd also like to make a point that we use the webinar fundamentals to get hints to help us keep our webinars engaging. And the Adobe Connect Essential training video was an invaluable tool to actually learn the software that none of us had experience with. How we used it was we ran through the whole training video once just to get an idea of what we could do within the webinar. And then we backed away from all of the software stuff and actually focused on what we were doing with the webinar. Then when it was time to create the webinar, we went back and looked at those specific points within lynda.com, because it allows you to go through exactly, how do I create a poll? I forget, that kind of thing. Both of these resources offer free trials. However, lynda.com is available for free through most public libraries. And it's not just Adobe Connect webinar software it has training on. A lot of the other popular softwares are available there too. So you can walk through and feel more comfortable with the software itself. Trust me, it really does help. Secondary tools we used. Well, there's a lot of them out there, and it depends on what you want to do. We used Microsoft Excel in the past. It's a good tool for creating graphs. Microsoft Publisher, because you can create some effects in Publisher that you can't in PowerPoint, but then you can copy those effects back into the PowerPoint. And then there's a lot of free online tools for creating infographics. So including the Wordle that Jeannie used earlier, Bitstrips where we created the caricatures. GIF creating tools are handy too, because a GIF is much smaller than a video, and you may need to be aware of the bandwidth available for your participants. That can be an issue with videos buffering and things like that, especially if you're through wireless. And there's a lot of other resources out there that you can search for, timelines. As I said, you're creating a lot of slides because that's all people have to look at. So, yeah, images are important. So we're going to talk about those next. Photos are a big resource. We were creating an image for about every 30 seconds of the time we speak. You may need to stage photo sessions. In the handout, I've included a couple of examples of release forms. Now, according to Mustafa Mirza of the Canadian Association of Professional Image Creators, their national office, a model release is not a guaranteed protection against a lawsuit, but they definitely help. I've included that one as a reference so you can note different types of phrases, and also because it is Canadian. The other one from Studio Binder has been included as a freely available online tool to use, and I've included the link in the handout as well. So if you need a model release, you can do that. Do include a clause on digital manipulation, because in this day and age, almost every photo you use, you're going to do some digital manipulation to it, even if it's just cutting it to fit or resizing it, that sort of thing. Alternatively, and less expensively, you can find photos and clip art online. So I've included some of the places I like to look for images, especially where you can find Creative Commons or no attribution required images. Where possible, look to be able to limit by the license. That way you're not looking at a lot of things going, oh, that would be perfect, but you can't use it. I like to look for modify or reuse with modifications or build upon licenses. When you're looking at a Creative Commons license, however, don't assume. You should always actually verify. Follow that link because there may be limitations on it or restrictions or requirements for you to do. Additionally, you can also ask for permission, and I have done that in the past. I've actually written the creator of an image or as in the handouts that we're using, and ask for permission to use these. Surprisingly, a number of people will give you that permission. Finally, think about creating a bibliography if you use other information from other sources or cited on the page. You don't actually have to show it at the time of your webinar, but you can provide it in the link to the full presentation for people who want to follow up. Jeannie is now going to run the conclusion to our session.
Thank you. For us, creating our first webinar was a huge challenge, but also extremely rewarding. We learned early on that there were no peer reviews of webinars, so we actually did it ourselves. As Jill mentioned, before we went live, we tested each of our webinars or presentations with select library staff members. Practice, 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 and try to get the feedback before the actual webinar. That's what really helped. In our case, we actually did dry runs of our webinars, and we used the focus group feedback to help us as we prepared. We had 3 focus groups: librarians, staff, and a general mix. Accessibility is also very important. Providing alternative access for people who are watching the recorded version. In this case, Adobe Connect automatically creates a transcript, so we didn't have to create notes in PowerPoint. Does your software you plan to use do this? If not, you will need to plan for it. As you're doing your webinar, think about what are you going to tell them, then tell them what you're going to do, and then tell them what you told them. In conclusion, webinars can be a very creative and cost-effective method for sharing information, teaching a specific tool, and for personal or professional development. We hope this webinar has provided you with some more resources as well as confidence as you start to develop your own webinars in the future. We now have some bit of time for question and answer period. If you do have any questions, please direct them in the chat window. And if they're general questions, you can just pop your questions in. But if you have a specific question for Jill and I, just attach the name so that we can get back to you. Okay, so I think Carly was asking about what software program would you recommend? And in our case, we didn't really have to deal with that question because we were already told as we were doing a session for the Ontario EI that they were going to use Adobe Connect. So that's what we had to use. So we didn't have to really make any recommendations on our own. However, I do want to point out that in lynda.com, they have under Webinar Fundamentals a listing of some of the softwares that they go through, and it has in length, in detail. They covered the following webinar softwares: Adobe Connect, which we used. They also covered Anytime Meeting, GoToWebinar, and WebEx. And there's another one that's very popular right now that's free, and that's Google Hangouts. So it depends, but if you really wanted to learn more about it, I would definitely recommend the Webinar Fundamentals because they also have a checklist, and they tell you for each software, they tell you the features, how useful it can be. The only missing thing is that they don't provide the actual cost of using those softwares, but I suggest that you also try getting getting a free trial for that. That's what I would recommend.
Okay, I'm going to start with some of the pre-submitted questions, and we'll answer some of those. While we're doing this, actually, I'm just going to flip to our contact slide, and if anybody is interested in contacting us and you think of questions in the future, you're welcome to reach us, okay? Okay, so from Natasha, in your experience, what are some of the best practices to increase attentiveness and interest while attendees are on the webinar? I think we did cover a lot of that in the session. Lots of slides, like I said before, every 30 to 40 seconds. Using webcams and video can cause buffering. For those of you not familiar with the term, that's when your video just spins and spins. and that will depend on your participants' download bandwidth. But again, that depends on your audience, and if it's okay, you figure your participants will be able to do that. It does add interest and lots of interaction. Lots of interaction is a big benefit to your webinar, and that will depend on your topic though. So we've also included a bibliography in the print version of the link version of the webinar, and check those out. We did find those helpful for us as well.
Okay, one question. I'm not sure, Carly, if I answered your first question. I think I answered the first part. I think the other one was, what was the most difficult component of planning a webinar? For us, I would say it was just getting the time to actually to get there, to actually do set up the time, getting together. I think for us that was the most challenging part because, as Jill had mentioned, we don't work in the same location, nor do we work the same shift. So I think that was the hardest part of it, of planning it. But once we got the content all laid out and we had access to the training, I think that was very beneficial. And following the part where, as we did the presentations, we made sure that we followed that protocol, that whoever did it last uploaded it with the date and their name. So that helped us as well. So I hope that answers your question, Carly. And how long did it take to plan to do the webinar? I would say quite a bit of time, but I think once we did our first one, then the other ones came. We learned from experience, so it took a lot less time.
What really helped us was we set up the free trial. And so actually things went a lot faster once we were able to conference about our planning and what we were doing through the free trial of Adobe Connect. They offer a one time a year, 30-day free trial. And so we could actually do our meetings there. We didn't have to do the traveling. We didn't have to do anything of that sort of thing.
Okay, I'm laughing at, sorry, I'm just laughing at Pregna's question about what do you do with the technical difficulty as a Wi-Fi shutdown? That's exactly what happened to me just before the webinar. I don't know if you were able to notice that, but I really didn't know what to do. So I actually had Jill, while you were doing, she ran in to tell me just start. So I had to shut down my computer, relog on, and do everything, right? And luckily, the Wi-Fi came back, but I think it was a Wi-Fi meltdown. So the thing is, try to keep calm. And if you have to, you might have to use another computer or, you know, luckily, as I had said, we knew that we've experienced technical difficulties, so we're getting better, I think, at just being a little bit more relaxed about it. But we know that it does happen. And I guess the other suggestion is make sure that you don't use a that you use a hardwired computer rather than a laptop. Jill's laughing.
Yes, I'm laughing. I'm laughing. Wi-Fi, as we noted in the webinar, can be an issue. Yes, there are limitations in terms of typing in questions versus the audience talking. But when you get a number of people talking, part of the problem with the webinar software is it cuts people in and out. So if you have two people talking over each other, you might get one word from somebody and another word from the other, and things like that. So it does make it more challenging when you're having a meeting. Um, and again, if you have partners who are across different areas, different time zones, even it's easier and more handleable. Additionally, we are primarily dealing with Adobe Connect because this is what CFICE is offering as a platform. But there are functionalities where, for example, the chairman, the host of the meeting, can, somebody raises their hand and they can turn on the mic. So there are options there as well. I do get it's more difficult to type in questions and it takes longer and you don't get that kind of free flow of thoughts happening. But we've just found it better in the past because of that cutout issue.
Another question that was raised was an hour-long recording can be lengthy for our busy members to watch. So my suggestion is to, in this case, webinars, you can probably break it down into series. So you can take a specific bit or topic and focus it on each time. Perhaps have a lunchtime series, and everybody should be able to have about half an hour. So you could do, for example, in this case, for this webinar, we can break it down into the first section being the webinar that covers an introduction and cover the benefits as well as best practices. And then you can have a part two that would cover the challenges and tools we used and a conclusion. So that would be a suggestion that if you don't have an hour, you can actually break it up into half an hour. Or if you really wanted to, even 15 minutes, targeting on what specific information you feel that is most important or people would like to hear.
Okay, we have another question here where somebody is already making webinars, and they find they have an attendance rate of about 50%, and they're looking for ways to make sure their great webinars are accessed by registrants. Unfortunately, research suggests that people use prices as a signal for value, and people value more what they pay for. So free, you'll generally get more people registering. Charge, and more people show up. Two researchers in business practices, Colodini and Thomas, both refer to this effect in their books. Even a small amount monetarily can make it more likely that registrants show up. I'm not sure how that would work for you legally or in terms of other things, but you can maybe offer it as an honorarium to the speaker, dedicate a webinar that you're doing to a particular charitable action, other possible strategies, I don't know. We all want to offer something for free, but it does mean that people are more likely to go, oh, well, it was free and I'm doing this now, so just a thought. We did have a question on what other softwares are available to use out there.
Okay.
So I'm just going to pop that link up really briefly, and actually you can talk over that if you need to, Magda, okay?
I think this concludes our webinar today, as I see we're approaching 3 o'clock. I'd like to thank our speakers, of course, Jeannie and Jill, for their informative presentation, and of course for answering everyone's questions and for getting to a lot of those questions and providing those great answers. And thanks also to all of you who are attending, who are participating as well. And I'll also remind you that the link to the webinar video will be sent out within about 24 hours with some additional resources as well that are going to be coming soon. And lastly, I encourage you to check out the CFICE website under the events section for the next CFICE webinar, which is going to happen on April 27th, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which will focus on tips and pointers for writing a successful grant application. And information about that webinar will also be sent to all of you in the post-webinar email that you're going to receive soon as well. The webinar information and registration will also be supplied in CFICE's upcoming newsletter on March 31st and on the events page on our website, as well. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Jeannie and Jill. This was a really informative webinar. It was great to hear from you, and thanks for your contributions to this knowledge. And I hope that all of you enjoy the rest of your day. We're going to sign off now, so thanks very much.